She's live. Let's get this stuck into Teams. What's the matter with your head? Oh, yeah. Thank you, YouTube, for informing me that I'm live. I'm well aware that I'm live because I am currently live. Hey. Right then, kiddios. I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes just to see people joining, and then I will get going. Please excuse my hair. This is it in its natural state, and I look like I've had my finger in a plug, which is, you know, great. Love it. I want the student view, please. Thank you kindly. Here we go. Right then, I am going to get going. I've been sat here for a minute and a half now, so I'm going to get going. I have posted this in Teams, so let's get those off as well. So hopefully you will be able to catch up on this. And I do need you to regularly interact with me, please, because I don't feel like a lot of you are. And I will get things sorted for you because it's just been one of those things. Right then, so next week we have half term. I will not be setting you any work. I will be sending feedback over of all your stuff because this week's just been a little bit hectic. And yeah, you'll get all of it by the end of next week, and we should all be square ready for next half term. Okay, so yesterday I got you to recap the Cold War so far. So just to kind of quickly go over that really, really quickly, is that we have the Grand Alliance of the UK, USA and the USSR. They are joined together in the Grand Alliance, fighting against the Nazis. They have a first meeting at Tehran where Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin meet up. There they decide that they're going to open up a second front in France with the USA and the UK, so that Germany have been split into fighting to try and stretch them and win the war. They agree that Russia are going to join the war against Japan once Germany's been defeated. They're going to set up the UN. They're going to have a discussion about Poland. So they start to make these discussions in the middle of the war. By the Yalta Conference, again, we've got the same leaders there of Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin for the USA, UK and the USSR. They again agree that they are going to divide Germany into four along with Berlin. They're going to set up the UN. Soviet Russia is going to get involved in the Japanese side of the war. There we go. There's the nervous tick of the yawn. And then they disagree over what reparations are going to be put in place, if any, and then the Polish border. But they decide now we'll leave that till later. Once the war has then been won in July 1945, they meet at Potsdam. Difference is Franklin D. Roosevelt has died of complications due to his link to his polio. Stalin's still there for the USSR. So FDR has been replaced now, and he was like the kind of middleman between Churchill and Stalin. He's been replaced by a very anti-communist leader called Truman. Then we've got Churchill loses the election and is replaced by Clement Attlee, who quite frankly doesn't care about being there. So is pretty useless. They agreed to divide Germany, so they cement that. They agree that the Soviets are going to have Eastern Europe as a kind of sphere of influence, which we'll look at today, what that actually means. And they also agree about how they're going to hunt down Nazi criminals, and there's going to be free elections are going to be held. However, when it then comes to the free elections, they do disagree on what they actually look like. So for Soviet Russia, it means one party with different people that they vote on, whereas in the West, it's multiple parties with multiple people. They also disagree on what the reparations are going to look like, and Stalin is not happy with the fact that they are going to get more industrial things rather than money. A big factor then is that Truman does drop in that he has been testing the atomic bomb, hasn't told Stalin, and Stalin is like, what? Excuse me? Who do you think you are? Kind of thing. And that's when then tensions start to ramp up. That, I believe, is where we then left it in our Cold War story so far. Trying to remember where you two different classes are. Yeah, perfect. Now, one of the issues then that is a big source of tension between the USA and the USSR is the fact that there is some Soviet expansion. Now, what I mean by that is Stalin was very, very concerned about the fact that Russia had now been invaded twice in as many years, very similar to kind of France. They'd been invaded in World War One, they'd been invaded in World War Two, and Stalin did not want that to happen. He was very, very concerned about that. So he wanted to create something called a buffer zone. Now, that just basically means effectively having things in front of his country that can be invaded first so that he can prepare. So it like limits the damage. Okay, so countries in front of the USSR as a way to protect the USSR. Okay, now I've spelled influence wrong. That's embarrassing. Now, these countries that are in the buffer zone are initially are in what we call the sphere of influence. Now, that is a region of the world where one state is dominant. Okay. So what we mean by that is it dominant or dominant? Yeah, dominant. So we mean by that is that the USSR were influencing, were having a big element of control and factors that would encourage countries to do something in Eastern Europe. But the Soviet Union then do go one step further. So initially in Eastern Europe, like East Germany, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, those kind of places, they are part of the buffer zone. They then become part of the sphere of influence as part of being in the buffer zone. But then that is not enough for Russia. So they have to go one step further and they create what we call satellite states. And that is then when the countries go from being influenced by that dominant country to being controlled by that country. So, for example, Ukraine is a little bit, some of it, a satellite state of Russia. So they run in a very similar way that Russia do, and they are controlled in the same manner that Russia is. Now, this was all done quite simply in one way. The way that the Soviet Union managed to do this was by leaving the Red Army, so that's their army, like we call the British military, in these particular countries. Now, if you see, let me get my map up for you. This is a map of Europe here. You can see that Russia is just here and they spread all the way up here, reaching Berlin first in Germany. Now, this is the Soviet zone here. So you've got a nice little go around line going there. So the Soviets then can control all of these countries initially, all right, by the Soviets, and then you've now got to factor in the Soviet zone of Germany, the Soviet zone of Austria, and then Czechoslovakia and Hungary. All of these countries along this line, here, are now in the Eastern Bloc, or in the eastern side of Europe. Okay, now that is quite worrying to the West. The West are not overly happy about that. Because that means that the Soviet idea is expanding, okay? And it then leads to, oh, she's tripping on things. It then leads to, okay, Soviet Russia then saying in these countries, when it comes to the free elections, okay, you can't have a free election, you've got to have my kind of election. So it then develops that these countries go from being buffer zone, sphere of influence to that satellite state, because they've now got communist governments running them in a nutshell and expanding communism out from the Soviet Union, which is not particularly great if you're looking from a Western American point of view. This is then only made worse by two very short but very impactful telegrams. And the first telegram is known as the long telegram. And this is what you have on your worksheet. If I just hold that there, I have very badly scanned that in for you. Now, this was written in 1946, so the year after the war. And it's written by a guy called George Kennan. Okay. Now, Kennan was a US official or an ambassador in Moscow. So each country, whether that is all over the world, they have a embassy or a diplomat that represents different countries in one country. So, for example, I have been to the American embassy. I have shortly will be going to the Qatari embassy. So there is a little bit of land or Qatar of Qatar in the UK around this embassy, and they abide by Qatari laws rather than British laws when they are on that soil. But then as soon as they leave, they have something called like diplomat status, and they are well respected within the community. Now, George Kennan is what he's at. He's a diplomat. Now, he writes to the American president because remember, he's living in Moscow. So he is in behind enemy lines. He is an American living by American rules in a communist country. So you can imagine how that goes down. Not well. And he writes, "It is clear that the United States cannot expect the foreseeable future to be close to the Soviet regime. It must continue to regard the Soviet Union as a rival, not a partner, in the political arena. It must continue to expect the Soviet policies will reflect no abstract love of peace and stability, no real faith in the possibility of a permanent happy coexistence of the communist and capitalist worlds. Rather, Soviet policies will be cautious, persistent pressure towards the disruption and weakening of all rival influences and rival power." It's basically then saying that the USSR are a rival, and they cannot be trusted. He's saying to Truman that, hang on a minute, you cannot take Stalin's word at face value. There is a hidden meaning behind it. There is always an underlying meaning to it. The Soviets want to expand. They are a real threat to capitalism, and things are not going to go well. You are not going to have a friendly relationship with the Soviets. It's very much going to be a rivalry. They're not going to be a partner, okay? Now, he talks about it must continue to expect the Soviet policies will reflect no abstract love of peace and stability, meaning that the Soviets are not worried about keeping war at bay. They're not worried about the fact that there's just been a war and the fact that there's now needs a period of peace and political stability. The Soviets are more worried about getting what they want when they want it. Okay, now, this is quite a significant telegram because it really has an impact on Truman's attitude. It means that Truman's attitude towards the Soviet Union only becomes more bitter, more suspicious, more paranoid. And he then also has that extra element of he really is anti-communist. Okay. He sees, Kennan expresses to Truman that the Soviet Union are aggressive and suspicious, and recommends that Truman then takes action against the Soviet Union. Okay. And it then greatly influences Truman's policies towards the Soviet Union. Okay, so that's major. Similarly, the Soviet Union do send their own telegram, and that is only because they know about the long telegram. So they get hold of this telegram, they know about it, they know it's going to the United States president, so they have to respond themselves. And they do that with a guy called, he's called Nikolai Novikov, and he is the Soviet ambassador to the USA. So he's effectively the George Kennan in America, but for the USSR. It's like the opposite of George Kennan. And it's sent in September 1946. Okay, so it's after, right? It's after the long telegram. And here's what it says. Obvious indications of the US effort to establish world domination oh my God, start again. It says, obvious indications of the US effort to establish world dominance are also to be found in the increase in military potential in peacetime and in the establishment of a large number of naval and air bases both in the United States and beyond its borders. In the summer of 1946, for the first time in history of the country, Congress passed a law on the establishment of a peacetime army, not on a volunteer basis, but on a basis of a universal military service. The size of the army, which is supposed to amount to 1 million persons as of July the 1st, 1947, will also increase significantly. And my dog Fletcher is about to interrupt. Hello, have you come to learn about the Cold War? You can't sit there, buddy. Can you lay down? Can you lay down? Good boy. I do apologise. You can now see his ear in the stream. So Novikov is then saying to Stalin that, okay, the USA want world dominance. Excellent. My stream is going so well. They want world dominance, okay? Now, that is going to be scary for Stalin because he is obviously trying to get his influence in the world, but he doesn't want America meddling in his own business. Now, it then hardens Stalin's attitude, okay? Because it's also talking about the USA increase in military. And it just makes Stalin more paranoid. And any inch of trust that had been built by Roosevelt with Stalin and that relationship between the USA and the USSR is completely smashed down by this telegram here. Stalin realizes he can't trust Truman. He can't trust the USA to do what they are saying they are going to do. He feels like they have been really suspicious and sneaky with how they are now building up an army in peacetime. And it really then worsens the relationship between Stalin and Truman as leaders and people, but it also then worsens the relationship between the USA and the USSR. And it starts to ramp up that rivalry between the two superpowers. And this then will lead on to how Truman's next bit of policy and what he does then with his American policies, and how then Stalin responds in terms of his expansion in the east of Europe and what he then puts into place in these Eastern European countries. What I'd like you to do today then, please, is I have put this on the Word document for you, and I have attempted to put a PDF on there for you so that you can see this. But I have got you do need to read that background that is at the top of the Word document and watch the following clip that I've attached about Soviet expansion that explains it a little bit better than I do. I then want you to read the 2 telegrams which I've attached. Again, I've explained them here. So if you are struggling, you do need to come back to the stream. I've put it in Teams for a reason to go over it. And I want you to pick out 3 things that, or 3 warnings that Kennan gives Truman about the USSR and what impact that might have on the Cold War. And then 2 warnings that Novikov gives to Stalin and how that might impact the Cold War. Please get those into me by email or by Teams, and then I'll have everything updated by next week, ready to go for the 1st of June, our first lesson back after half term. Have a good one. Make sure you send me your work, and if you need anything, give me a shout. Bye.